Hello, this is Scott Jentz. Welcome to Sandbox Stories. Hello, welcome to this Sandbox Story, which is an interview with Scott Shapiro. He's an industry veteran from the optical side of the business, owner of Europa Eyewear, and someone who's been deeply committed to advancing the business of eye care. Scott, welcome to Sandbox Stories.
Hi, Dr. Jens. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. Before we talk about you, let's talk about the business that you run today. It started by your parents. Tell us about your dad's early days as a frame rep and how he and your mom got this business started.
So, my dad famously used to say, "It's not just eyewear that I love; it's people." He felt like he was in the people business. I know he's probably not the first person to say that, but my dad was a natural salesperson. As far as I've been told, for many years, even before I was born and before he started here. He just wanted to sell. He sold shoes when he was really young, tried to start a belt business at one point, and eventually found himself in the eyewear business, selling eyewear for a number of different distributors. And he married my mom. They both got the idea that maybe they could do this on their own. And so they started Europa Eyewear. They named it Europa because they wanted to emphasize the fact that the products were made in Europe at that time. Like today, that was a real selling point. And, it was right around the time where distributors were turning into manufacturers here in the United States. And when I say that, I don't mean that they were actually manufacturing things here. They weren't. But there was like a middleman being cut out. Regional distributors that relied on importers who had relationships with factories, that was changing at that moment. And so my dad was sort of it was sort of good timing in the sense that he was able to then start to do his own importing. He loved to travel, and he saw his business as an opportunity to get him to see the world. So he started traveling to Paris and to Milan and eventually to Hong Kong and eventually to Wenzhou, China, where he would then source that product and bring it here to the United States.
So this is all happening about the time you were born. Is that right?
More or less, yeah. So they started the business in 1977. I don't mind. I'm not so shy that I can't tell you how old I am. So I was born in 1979. So I tell people, and this is very genuine, I am an only child, but Europa, this business is absolutely not only my sibling, but the firstborn, literally and figuratively. And so I grew up. This business has for since I've been born. I've had it's been. We have a little bit of a sibling rivalry, but for the most part, there's a lot of love, and we were certainly raised in the same household.
You're from the northwestern Chicago suburbs. What was it like as a child with this business as a bigger brother? You must have had some great times with your parents as an only child. What did you do as a kid?
Yeah, so I mean, most people that grow up in family businesses can probably relate to this. This was my first job. I probably started working here mostly out of boredom because my parents didn't have anything else to do with me while they were here. So, whether it was picking and packing orders in the warehouse or literally my first job was just to make boxes, right? Boxes come in those big flat cardboard,
Stacks, yeah.
yeah, right. And so somebody's got to fold them up. That was my first job. And yeah, I mean, I think I think I did learn a lot. And again, I think probably others can relate to this. I learned a lot just through osmosis, especially being an only child, because both of my parents worked in the business. It was the topic of conversation all the time. And so, dinner conversation, I like to say we were either going to talk about Europa, or we're going to talk about my report card. So I was very interested in talking about what was happening at Europa. And and a lot of times featured my dad, with too many explicit four-letter words, talking about some sales rep that wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and so that's the environment that I grew up in, and I did, of course, at that time, as a young person, I never recognized how special that was and how much that would become a part of my life moving forward. But looking back now, there's no doubt I would not have wanted it any other way.
So I have to ask, does any of your childhood experiences factor into your eventual path to stand-up comedy?
uh, my dad was also kind of a funny guy, and humor has always been a real priority for my family and for this business. There's always been a lot of laughter around here, and so I guess as a value, it's something that I grew up with. But I don't know that I can necessarily connect Europa with my love for stand-up comedy, except to say that by the time it was, I was old enough to decide what I wanted to do in my life, I knew that one thing I didn't want to do is have anything to do with eyewear. So I had to find something else so that I could get away from what I grew up with, which again, I think is pretty common.
And you ended up studying at Second City?
Yeah. So I worked in radio. I studied journalism in college, and I got a radio internship while I was in college. I loved music. And so I just wanted to, and I loved morning radio. And so to be involved in that, the idea that, people could just kind of show up and have fun and make jokes for a living was the coolest thing in the world to me. And I started to meet, and through my internship, I met people who did this for a living. They had kids, they had families, they made a really good income, they had normal lives, but they didn't have to do the things that most of the normal people that I knew had to do at their jobs. And so I thought that was really cool. So that was the path I took. I worked in morning radio as an executive producer and an on-air personality for about 12 years between Phoenix and Miami. And in between that time, I had about 4 months, or no, about 6 months, and I came back here to Chicago to study at Second City, not knowing that I was going to get another job in radio soon. And that's when I met my wife. So it's like everybody's got a story, and it's always fortuitous how things work out.
Where in this whole process did you end up traveling to Australia?
Well, that was a matter of pure privilege. That I went in college. I had the opportunity to study abroad, and so I lived for 6 months just outside of Sydney, Australia. That was now almost 30 years ago. So as I understand it, that city and that country is very different than it was when I was there. But it was a very cool place to spend time when I was young. That's for sure.
Back to the the time in radio, I think that a lot of people think it's a lot cooler than it really is. But was it enough? I mean, I know you ended up going to Second City. Was it enough to make the ends meet and do what you wanted to when you had, left home and you were working hard, I'm sure. Did it pay reasonably?
Yeah. So by the time I left that industry, when I was living in Miami, my title was executive producer. I was also hosting a sports show on the other Clear Channel station across the hall. And yeah, I was working for a very successful show. So I don't mind telling you, it was a long time ago. So this was 2009. I was making a salary of like 75,000, and then about another $25,000 worth of endorsements. So and I was like, in my late 20s. So yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate. Most of the guys I was doing stand up with, because I would do radio in the morning and then I would do stand up in the evenings. And most of the guys I was doing stand up with, they were like, waiters and bartenders or pizza delivery guys, like whatever. They were just trying to. And so the fact that I kind of got to have a real job, and that was always my philosophy too. And I say this to anybody today who wants to be an actor or any kind of artist, entertainer. Like if you can you're not. Who cares if you're not the richest guy in town? You're not gonna buy a house in the Hamptons, but if you can make a living doing this, your dream, you're a winner. That's like 1% of the people that want to do that. I mean, so yeah, to me, it was fun. I was lucky to be able to make a living doing it. But I will also say that around the time that I left, broadcast radio was not in a good place, and since then it's gotten even worse. So the economics were changing as I was doing it. I saw a lot of my friends and coworkers being laid off. It was sort of a constant churn in that regard. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot that I use today, in terms of like how to deal with a challenging market, how to deal, what that does to a business and to a culture when success is not easy, and sometimes some difficult decisions have to be made. That happens, eventually in every industry. Certainly happened to us during COVID, and being able to sort of survive and live in that environment was a very helpful lesson for me.
Well, let's return to the family business because some unfortunate circumstances brought you back in 2010, and you've been with the company since. Give us a sense of what it was like and what happened.
Yeah, so I was living in Miami, really loved my job, was actually under contract with Clear Channel, and my parents were still alive. They were running this business, but really, my dad's sort of right hand man, his best friend, Jerry Wallowitz, was running the day to day business here in Chicago as president. And I got a phone call one morning that my dad had died of a heart attack suddenly. So, and my dad and I were very close. I definitely, I mean, again, I don't mind saying I was about 30 years old at the time, and up until that time, I knew that eventually my parents were going to pass away, and that eventually I would lose my dad. That's what that's the natural course of things. But I really thought that whenever that happened, I would not be able to cope with it. Like that somehow I was just not going to be able to make it through that.
Mhm.
And I think I learned an extraordinary lesson that I think, I suppose most people do at some point, which is that there are probably a lot of things in life that you can't imagine dealing with. And then when you have to deal with them, it's like your mind finds a way, your soul finds a way. And all of a sudden, like something flips and you manage it. And that's what happened to me. The you know the problem was we didn't really have a succession plan for our business, and at that time there were probably about 100 people, 100 employees here at Europa, maybe 75 employees here at Europa. I had grown up understanding that those 75 people that worked here all had families, and that those families were all more or less our responsibility. And so I took that very seriously, and it just seemed. And of course, my mom had just become a widow, and again, I didn't have any brothers and sisters, so it just seemed like there was a lot of need for me to be here and be a part of this business. Um, but that being said, I think that a lot of people that I've told this story to, or a lot of people who have heard this story, like to think that I made some kind of massive sacrifice, or maybe I don't mind people thinking that I made some massive sacrifice when I left Miami to come here and be a part of this business. But the reality is that this is. I learned very quickly that this is such an unbelievable blessing to be in a family business like this one, and especially in this industry, which I think is a very special place. Um, and it quickly became obvious to me that this is where I belonged. This was not just the best thing for Europa or for Jerry or for my mom. It was absolutely the best thing for me too.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the importance of your relationship with the president, Jerry Wolowitz. I mean, you've developed this friendship that you describe as almost like a brotherhood. How did the two of you figure out how to guide the company forward? I know your mom was still involved. What did that look like, say, in the subsequent 5 to 7 years as you got back involved?
Well, I would say for the first year or two, it was really just a matter of like, uh, settling everything down, right? So first of all, I had a great deal to learn. No doubt, I had a lot of instincts and a lot of that sort of that osmosis learning I mentioned that helped me, but I had no idea. I would not have been able to run this business. If Jerry hadn't been here, we would have been in big trouble. My mom was deeply involved, mostly on the product and creative side. But with all due respect to her, she wasn't in the position to run the business, and I wouldn't have been either. So the first year or two was really about us just making sure that everyone in the company was comfortable with this new direction, this new leadership without my dad being here. Almost all of them had been hired directly by my dad. They were, when I say, I hesitate to use this phrase, but it was true for him. They worked for him. And when I say they worked for him, I don't mean like they did his bidding. I mean like they worked hard because they didn't want to disappoint him. And so that was a really difficult thing for us to lose. And it was something that, again, we really just needed a year or two to, I think, get our feet under us, for me to learn the business, for Jerry and I to develop, sort of our working relationship together, and to stabilize everything. And then at that point, that was probably like 2012. And then we really started to talk about, okay, like, what can we do differently? What can we do? We've got this incredible foundation. What can we do to really accelerate this business? And that's when it really started to become fun.
Where along the line did you diversify the company? I know state is one of your favorite lines now. Like, when did you decide to do that?
So right about that time. So a couple of things that we started to do really differently than my dad had chosen to do them in the past. First of all, we became much more deliberate about developing relationships with other organizations in the industry. So my dad was a pretty well-known person, developed relationships very easily, had a lot of one-on-one friendships, and a lot of graces with every aspect, be our vendors, our customers, and our peers. But he was really hesitant to get involved in some of these other organizations and many of them were just popping up too. If you talk about like buying groups and Doctor Alliance groups. But he really kind of had this attitude, like, I don't need to be spending a bunch of time with my competitors. I'll keep my head down. I'll focus on my customers, and you guys can go have your meetings or whatever you're going to do. And we really took a different tact. I took a different tact with Jerry's support that, especially with my background of stand up and just speaking publicly, that I could go around to some of these organizations, particularly opticianry organizations that represent our buyers, and introduce Europa to our customers in ways that we had never really tapped into before. So that was one change that we made, one opportunity we took advantage of that I think was really effective. The other, we actually had a whiteboard in my office that Jerry and I would sit around, and we had 10 things on that list of big changes that we could make that we thought could double the size of our business if we took them on effectively. And number one was manufacture our own product here in the United States. So again, Europa was a company. And if you asked my dad what he did for a living, he would say, I import eyeglass frames. That was his service what he provided. So the idea of building a factory here in the United States and making it ourselves is something I think he probably never would have allowed himself to dream of. And frankly, none of our peers would either, because we went around and we asked some of the friends that we had in the industry, including our vendors, said, hey, we're thinking about building a factory here in the US to make some of our collections, which eventually became State. And they all told us we were totally insane. You guys are crazy. It's never going to work, for all the reasons that are probably obvious to you and then many others. But that is something, but again, so much of the relationship I have had with Jerry over the last 15 years has been, maybe me coming up with an idea that's crazy and then him figuring out how we're going to do it. And him telling me, okay, we can do that. Because, for every one that he tells me we can do, there's 99 others he tells me we can't. And those don't see the light of day. but this was one that he was also really excited about, and so that's what we started to do. And in 2014, we found a couple guys in California who were making frames by hand, more or less, and we convinced them to move here to Chicago to help us build this factory. And they did an incredible job, and that's how State was born.
Story. It's impossible to speak about relationships without talking about the family that you've grown with your wife. You met at Second City. Tell us about how that evolved. Another comedian at heart?
Yeah. So Amanda actually moved to the city of Chicago just to study improv. I don't know if people do that anymore, but there was like a brief period of time where that was not such a, or at least I knew a lot of people that were doing that, back in the early 2000s. She graduated from University of Arizona and moved out here. And I met her while I was in between radio jobs, studying at Second City. I think she actually finished Second City. I did not. But she went through that whole process, and she was working in marketing for a while. And when we opened the factory and we launched State, we were trying to do something on a level that we didn't have the bandwidth or the team for, and that we had never done before. And Amanda, just through pure grit and some of what she had learned in marketing, was able to kind of step in and help us build that State brand into, again, what I think today is still on a different level from all of the rest of our brands, just in terms of the way we present it to the world. And so she just kind of started dabbling in that. And eventually it became a full-time job. I mean, we definitely needed what she could offer. And so today she's our VP of trade marketing, and she's actually in the office next to me right now.
You made this point earlier that I hadn't thought about, that people who have a comedic or entertainment kind of approach to life also have the ability then to be good messengers, right? And so it makes sense that you guys have been able to together advance a brand. You don't always have to be on script. Like I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, I really can't. The thing I'm most blessed about when it comes to my career, and I've been very fortunate in many ways, but the thing that I get to do that very few people in life get a chance to do is really like mold my position into one that fits me really well. So I had this background that most people would say, okay, you were in radio, you're doing stand up, now you're going to sell eyeglasses, or you're going to run an eyeglass company. Like, how is that transferable? Well, for a lot of people, it might not be, but I was able, again, because Jerry was so stable and so strong at running the day-to-day business, it allowed me to sort of create whatever made sense for me. And so going out to, for instance, the Opticians Association of America leadership conference, or to PECA national meetings, or whatever it was, and then getting on stage. And this is no disrespect to the other people who sometimes give presentations at these meetings, but they're not stand-up comics. they're in many cases, they're saddled with the responsibility of telling what is kind of a boring story, and they can't own it the same way I can, right? Because they've got a boss. Their boss is telling them they've got to say this, this, and this. They got to make sure they get it. I don't have to do any of that. I can go up and show funny videos of my son dancing on stage, and people love it. And then I can stick around for the next 2 days, and eventually we'll start to talk about eyewear. And that has really been sort of like my philosophy. And it's not just mine, right? Like I grew up with that. My dad did the same thing. He just took a different direction to get there.
Well, we have a chance. Tell us about your kids.
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking, because obviously it's one of my favorite things. So my son, Alan, is 9 years old. He actually, he went to the first 4 expos of his life. So up until 2 years old, he was at every expo. We would cart him around. Another thing I learned from my parents very early on is that babies and little kids sell frames. They just do. So, everybody And he loves a crowd too, so he was totally into it even back then, and still is today. He's spoken at our national sales meeting, usually about Star Wars, but he loves it. And our daughter she just turned 3 in September, and she's been a little bit more sheltered from the business because now we have 2, so you can't bring them the same way that we used to. We used to when Alan was little. But it's really, I mean, it's really important, I know, to both Amanda and me that that our kids understand how special this is. It was something that my parents tried to impart on me at a very early age. That lots of people might love their jobs, and certainly it's great to hopefully make a good income, but that growing up in an environment like this one is really a very, very special experience, and you can't take it for granted.
And I know you told me before we met that you were a music and movie junkie, and you had this relationship with music. You go to concerts, but the most interesting thing you told me is that your son knows every word to the Billy Joel song "We Didn't Start the Fire," which is fascinating.
So I know that this is fleeting. People have told me this, but Alan is at this perfect age where he still will like listen to and do the things that I want to do. Like it's such an awesome age because like now I just have a buddy who will do the stuff that I want to do. Like he'll watch I didn't have anybody watch football with me, and my wife would make me turn it off. But now that my son loves it, now it's like everything is okay. So it's fine for me to take Friday off to drive to Cleveland to go see Billy Joel if I bring my son. And my son is like more into it than I am. So yeah, I mean, a little tip for anybody who has kids younger than mine: get them into the stuff that you like early. It will benefit you, and they will love it, and everybody will win. But yes, a party at our house does not go by, or even a guest coming to our house cannot come to our house without Alan asking the Google speaker to play "We Didn't Start the Fire" so that he can show that he knows every word to that song. It would be nice if he learned what they all mean. He doesn't know any of that. He knows who JFK is. Other than that, he's still got a lot of learning to do.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good song to do it with. You back to your idea of building relationships, right? This industry is interesting because if we use the relationship quotients we build with others first, whether you're a doctor taking care of patients, an optician trying to create an eyewear benefit for a patient, you on the vendor side, you know, we're all doing kind of the same thing. It's not really very as much transactional as it might be in dermatology.
Mhm.
And so as a vendor, I don't think a lot of the doctors that are listening to my podcast understand how much work is on the backside to support them. Can you tell us a little bit of how you guide your business to make sure that the people that are today working for you and Jerry are working hard on the relationship side? That must be something you continually feed to your folks.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you bring up the relationship that doctors, optometrists have with their patients, because I think there's a lot of kinship between eyewear companies like ours, like Europa, and others like it, and independent ODs. First of all, we're both independent businesses, so and we're both in many cases facing the same obstacles, the same factors, but also the way that we develop relationship with our customers is very similar too. I mean, I've seen it so many times. Successful ODs, right? If they're business owners, certainly it's not just about examining eyes, right? I mean, developing, being a part of a community, developing relationships with your patients, having conversations with them, making sure that they trust you, making them feel welcome in your office. It's exactly the same for us on our side, and the way we develop trust is maybe slightly different. But we've told our sales reps for years when we interview them, um, our goal is not to, your goal as a sales rep cannot be to sell more glasses. Your goal has to be to take better care of your customers, make sure that you can say yes as often as possible to those ODs and to the buyers in their offices. And then naturally over time, if you're doing the right thing all the time, if you're taking care of them, then your sales will grow. Obviously, we want your sales to grow, but you can't think of it the other way around. You can't think, oh, I have to grow my sales, so I'm going to try to maybe provide better service. The service has to come first. The trust has to come first. And um, and so, and I think, this is true, I think, for many businesses, but in ours, so much of developing trust is just about consistency. Be there, be there in person, show that you're going to show up there every, whatever it is, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, and develop that relationship, not just because you're charming and you like to have conversation. Hopefully that's true, but also because you're now going to be a reliable, consistent contributor to that business. They need you to be there regularly, and you're going to prove that you're going to be there regularly by being there regularly.
Yeah, and you become a resource
Mhm,
that can be asked not just for favors, but for guidance. And I
mhm.
think that sort of advisory or consultative approach to developing relationships, and a word you've used many times, trust is what endears a person to their vendor, to their doctor, to their optician. And in a time where we volunteer less and less, you continue to do these things to give back. You've been volunteering with the Vision Council for a number of years. I mean, can you tell me how you're how you're doing that upon everything else? Because I'm sure it aids the profession.
Yeah. So, again, having grown up in this business, um, it's the health of the industry is something that I take very personally, and that I'm very passionate about. Uh, and I think, part of that is because we've always been very confident in our business. Whatever concerns we've had about the future of our business, it always seems to be that we're worried about some kind of external factors. And so it was very natural to me when I learned about the Vision Council, that when I found out that there was this trade organization whose real purpose is to support businesses like ours, um, that was something that I latched onto right away. That I thought this is a really wonderful resource and effort, that many of our many parts of the industry aren't aware of. And so I got very excited about being involved. They have the Vision Council has an event, their leadership summit, in a beautiful place, usually in Florida or California, once a year in January. So I started to attend that event, and again, that is exactly the type of event that my dad would have said, "I don't have time for that. That's not," but it was something that I really related to, on a very real level very quickly. And so I got to know Mike Hundert, who was the owner of REM Eyewear, one of our direct competitors. And he was so kind to me, always asking me, are you going to be coming to the event? He was really a great ambassador for the Vision Council, because if not for him, I don't think I would have ever been involved. And he was always encouraging me to come to those events and to get involved. And eventually, he asked me to join the board of directors. And once I joined the board of directors, I mean, I was totally hooked. And so I've been serving on that board now for probably 6 or 7 years. I sit as chairman today, and I'll be rolling off to immediate past chair at the end of this year, and I'll be on the board for another at least 2 years. But yeah, it does take a lot of time, obviously, but to me, it also, and I'll say this. This sounds like a cliche, but it's really true. Whatever I've given to the Vision Council, they've given much more back to me. Because when you get a chance to sit on the board of directors and sit in a room with 20 of literally the most influential people in our industry and listen to how they solve problems, how they tackle issues, what they think about our industry, you're walking away much smarter than you were when you walked into that room. And I just think it's a very enriching experience on every level.
I really thank you for doing that work, and I think it's a motivation to those of us listening to your stories that we would all take a little time to do that, whether it's in our community, in our associations, or elsewhere. I fully understand and often agree with the idea that if we could capture a little more time for ourselves in a busy, technology driven world, that we would grab those things quickly and put family first. But you have to have that balance yourself. And sometimes it means giving back. Maybe it's just to the school you went to or to your community, as I said earlier. So I appreciate that. So All right, let's let the ad lib expert, the radio comedian, but now business leader, give us the last word of advice. What would be the big advice you try to give us as we think about taking this profession forward at some point into the 2030s?
Man, I know our industry is changing, and I know that one-to-one relationships, at least for businesses like ours, it's hard to say that they are as important as they have been in the past. With consolidation, there are less independent offices out there buying eyewear. But if I was, and I think this is true for everybody, but especially if I was talking to somebody who wanted to get into eyewear like the way that my dad did 40 years ago, I would still tell him that, or her, that the same equation still stands today. That you got to get yourself out there, and you have to build those relationships in person as much as possible. It is a slick marketing campaign, a clever slogan, great photography, all those great product. All those things are valuable, but all of your competitors have that. If the more you can do, and it can be very exhausting, but the more you can do to find ways to network and meet people and get yourself, you as an individual, not somebody who works for you, out there to meet your customers, meet your peers, meet your vendors. That to me, that's the only recipe for success that I know.
I take something from what you're saying today, and this idea that you're putting your whole self into your business. And somebody might say, well, it's a family business. Yeah, but you went on your own journey and circumstance brought you back and you had this revelation. It was great. You're also doing it, you and your wife together, by bringing your kids to meetings, or now doing things together with them as parents, showing them what your parents showed you. It seems like that must be a core principle that you really took from your parents, that you put your whole self into everything you do. And I think sometimes we don't. I really appreciate that about your stories.
Thank you, doctor. Actually, I don't think anybody's ever put it to me that way, but you're 100% right. And it is a deliberate choice, although one that I grew up with. It is a deliberate choice to make this business a part of every part of me. And I, again, it's what I grew up with. So maybe I just don't know any different. But it definitely, I think it's been good. I think my wife would also say that she wouldn't want it any other way. And my kids will almost certainly go through a period of time where they say this sucks, but hopefully they'll have the same journey that I did, and eventually come back and recognize how special it is.
Well, two things, right? We have to meet adversity to understand what it's like to be in a good spot. And
Mhm.
sometimes, you can't just read that in a book, you have to do it. And being intentional is really something that is hard for a lot of us because, whether it's our own physical or mental incapacities, things that we just feel like we can't get over, or circumstances that aren't. In your case, you brought up the idea of your trip being something of being opportunistic. What was the word you used? It was privileged, right? And so let's help each other, folks. Let others become as opportune as we are by being really intentional about what we do. I bet you those families are really glad they're working forward with you now, aren't they?
I certainly hope so. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're trying to create an environment as much as possible to make that the case.
Well, I'm reasonably sure they are. Scott Shapiro, thank you so much for sharing your stories as my guest on this episode of Sandbox Stories.
Thank you so much for having me, doctor. It's been a pleasure.
And to the audience, as always, thank you for attending. Until my next Sandbox story, be great at all you do.